In 2241, Shady Sands was home to more than 3,000 people. It had paved streets, working electricity, and a government building where representatives from half a dozen settlements met to draft laws. 20 years later, it was the capital of the new California Republic, a nation of over 700,000 citizens, stretching from the Boneyard to the Mojave, fielding an army of 30,000 soldiers and minting its own currency. In 2142, it was 13 people sleeping in tents around a cooking fire. They had 11 days of water, no weapons heavier than a hunting rifle, and every single one of them had lived their entire lives underground. The transformation took less than a century. This wasn't inevitable. Most vault communities that opened to the surface didn't make it past the first winter. The ones that did rarely grew beyond a few hundred people scraping by in the ruins. Shady Sands became something else entirely. But to understand how Shady Sands became what it did, we need to start with the people who built it, along with the nightmare they were running from. Vault 15 was never meant to save anyone. Vault-Tec designed it as Experiment 15A, a controlled test of social cohesion under stress. The company filled it with 100 people from radically different backgrounds: religious fundamentalists, anarcho-communists, suburban conservatives, urban socialists, preppers, pacifists. Every ideology Vault-Tec psychologists could cram into a single facility. The question was simple: would diversity create adaptability, or would it tear the vault apart? For 60 years, the answer was adaptability. Vault 15 developed a rotating council system, compromise-based resource allocation, and a culture that treated disagreement as normal. Children grew up speaking 3 or 4 languages. The archives show low violence, stable population growth, and by 2077 standards, remarkable mental health scores. The vault's designers built it for 500 people maximum, with life support rated for 200 years, assuming 0 population growth. By 2090, Vault 15 held 843 people. The air recyclers ran 24 hours a day. Water rations dropped to 4 liters per person. The council meetings, once monthly, happened every week, then every 3 days. For decades, the experiment held, but everything changed the day the vault's life support began to fail. On April 2, 2097, the primary air scrubber seized. The backup unit, original equipment from 2077, lasted 16 hours before its bearings gave out. The council had no spare parts, no way to manufacture new ones, and CO2 levels rising 0.3% every 6 hours. The vote to open the door was 9-4. Over the next 6 months, Vault 15 emptied. The first group, 90 people, headed east toward what the archives called Barstow. The second went south. A third group, the largest, 240 people, pushed west toward the coast, convinced they'd find other vaults or pre-war cities with salvageable infrastructure. Aradesh's group was the smallest, 13 people, 5 women and 8 men, ages 19 to 54. They took 2 weeks of food, 40 liters of water, a dozen hand tools, 6 vault suits, and a Geiger counter with a cracked display. Aradesh had spent 3 years on the vault's agricultural team and remembered an archive entry about seasonal rivers in the northern valleys. They walked out on October 12, 2097, into a desert where the daytime temperature hit 102 degrees Fahrenheit. What they found 2 days north would decide whether they'd survive the month. The site they found was barely more than a depression in the hardpan. A ring of collapsed limestone held a pool fed by an underground spring, maybe 40 feet across, surrounded by patches of alkaline soil thin enough to see bedrock through. The temperature dropped to 38 degrees Fahrenheit at night, and there were no trees, just brittle scrub that snapped when you touched it. They built the first shelters from vault paneling they'd hauled on their backs, burying half of each structure to escape the heat. Rationing was brutal. 1,200 calories per adult, 8 ounces of water every 6 hours. Aradesh posted watches in 4-hour rotations because raiders had hit a caravan 6 miles south 2 weeks before they arrived. By December, they had 14 semi-permanent structures and had started planting vault seed stock in soil they'd enriched with human waste and composted scrub. The spring held. The walls, such as they were, kept out the wind. For 3 months, it looked like they might actually make it. But water and walls weren't enough. Something was killing their crops, and they had no idea what. The first plants died in neat rows, shredded at ground level. Then the night watch found puncture marks in the soil, each hole the diameter of a pencil, descending at sharp angles. On March 9, 2098, a settler named Chen went to check the irrigation line at dawn and didn't come back. They found him 40 feet from camp, stung 7 times, his skin already turning gray. Rad scorpions, a nest, maybe 20 strong, living in the limestone caves beneath the spring. They came up at night to hunt, and the vibrations from planting had drawn them to the crops. Aradesh tried everything: pit traps that collapsed, spears that shattered on chitin, a controlled burn that only drove them deeper. A second settler died in May, trying to seal a tunnel entrance with rubble. The colonists stopped planting. They talked, quietly, about moving again. Aradesh knew they didn't have the supplies for another march, and he knew what moving meant. They'd scatter, and the community would die on the road. The solution didn't come from within. It came from a stranger no one expected to see. The vault dweller walked into camp on June 3, 2161, 63 years after the settlement was founded. Blue jumpsuit, Pip-Boy on the wrist, a 10mm pistol, and a look that said they'd been walking for weeks. They were from Vault 13, 140 miles northeast, and they were hunting for a water chip their vault systems desperately needed. Aradesh made the deal in under 10 minutes. Clear the rad scorpion nest, and Shady Sands would share everything they knew about regional geography, trade routes, and settlements, plus 3 days of food and water. The vault dweller went into the caves that afternoon with a hunting rifle and 46 rounds. It took 4 hours. The gunfire echoed up through the limestone, then stopped. When the vault dweller emerged, covered in ichor and carrying a scorpion tail as proof, Aradesh had the settlement's entire supply of stimpaks waiting. By nightfall, the colonists had sealed 6 tunnel entrances with concrete they'd been saving for a cistern. That act of violence saved the town, but the conversation that followed changed its trajectory forever. Aradesh spent the next morning walking the perimeter with the stranger, asking questions. The vault dweller described a settlement called the Hub, 140 kilometers south, where caravans traded everything from Brahmin leather to pre-war electronics. Another town, Junktown, had organized around a casino and a functioning generator. They weren't thriving exactly, but they were connected. They moved goods, shared information, survived together. Aradesh had always assumed Shady Sands would stay small. 50 people farming mutfruit and dodging rad scorpions until the well ran dry, or the raiders got lucky. But if other towns were out there, if trade routes existed, isolation was a choice, a bad one. He started sketching maps that night, plotting caravan routes, drafting letters to settlements he'd never seen. The vault dweller left 2 days later with enough supplies to reach Junktown. Aradesh watched him disappear into the hills and turned back toward his office, already drafting the town's first export inventory. First, though, he had to deal with the daughter, who'd vanished 3 days earlier. Tandi, 16 years old and bored with rad scorpion drills, had slipped out the east gate to explore a pre-war gas station she'd spotted from the watchtower. She made it 3 kilometers before the Khans found her. The raider tribe ran the hills north of Shady Sands like a kingdom, 40 bikers armed with spiked bats and hunting rifles, taking what they wanted. Aradesh found her blanket near the highway, still warm. No blood, no body. That meant hostages, which meant ransom. He sent runners to every farmer within 20 kilometers, called an emergency council, then did something he'd sworn he'd never do. He sent a rider south to find the vault dweller and beg for help a second time. The stranger returned 4 days later with a 10mm pistol and a plan that relied heavily on the Khans being drunk. Aradesh offered everything Shady Sands had. The vault dweller asked for stimpaks and directions. Then he walked north into the hills alone. What she saw in that raider camp would shape her politics for the next 80 years. The vault dweller hit the Khan camp at dawn, when half the raiders were still passed out from jet and whiskey. Tandi heard gunfire, then screaming, then boots on gravel. She was out and running before her guard even turned around. Years later, she'd describe what she'd seen in that camp with clinical precision. 40 raiders burning through a year's worth of scavenged supplies in a week, fighting each other for status, keeping captives instead of forming alliances. The Khans were strong enough to terrorize 100 kilometers of wasteland, but too disorganized to hold territory. They raided Shady Sands because they'd never thought to trade with it. Tandi watched them collapse under pressure from one man with a plan, and realized that hierarchy built on violence alone was brittle. Cooperation wasn't idealism, it was infrastructure. She walked back into Shady Sands with a bullet graze on her shoulder and a notebook full of observations about power, logistics, and why raiders always lose in the long run. Aradesh held her for 10 minutes, then asked her to brief the council. She was 16, she'd just survived a kidnapping, and she'd already started designing the government that would outlive her. But the Khans weren't the only threat circling the young settlement. By 2061, caravan routes across New California were disappearing, not ambushed, just gone. The Brahmin, the guards, the cargo, all of it vanished like someone had erased them from the wasteland. The reports that made it back spoke of green giants, 8 feet tall, strong enough to rip a death claw apart with their bare hands. Settlements that had traded with Shady Sands for years went silent. No smoke signals, no travelers, just empty buildings and bloodstains baked into the sand. Aradesh doubled the guard rotations. He sent scouts north, east, west, anywhere but south, toward the boneyard, where the rumors said these creatures were massing. The scouts who went south never came back. Shady Sands locked its gates at night for the first time in 5 years. Tandi organized militia drills. They rationed ammunition they didn't have enough of, and prayed to gods they weren't sure existed. The war that could have ended everything happened 100 miles south, and most of Shady Sands never knew how close they came. On March 3, 2162, the vault dweller walked into the cathedral in the boneyard and found the master, the psychic warlord who'd been turning wastelanders into super mutants for 7 years, building an army to remake humanity in his image. What happened in that room is still debated. Some say the vault dweller showed the master proof that his super mutants were sterile, that the unity would die in a single generation. Others say he just set off a nuclear bomb in the basement and walked away. Either way, by April the super mutant army had scattered. Without the master's telepathic command, the unity collapsed into confused bands wandering the wastes. Caravans started moving again. Settlements sent scouts south and found the cathedral reduced to radioactive rubble. News reached Shady Sands in late spring, carried by a merchant who'd seen the ruins himself. Aradesh held a feast that lasted 3 days, but the vault dweller never showed up to receive thanks. The hero who saved the region would never be welcome in the vault he saved it for. Vault 13's overseer met the vault dweller at the entrance, thanked him for saving the vault, and told him he could never come home. The official reason was contamination, the idea that 5 months in the wasteland had changed him too much. The real reason was simpler and uglier. The overseer had spent 84 years maintaining Vault 13's isolation, convincing 1,000 people that the outside world was death. Then the vault dweller came back, talking about towns and trade routes, about people surviving and rebuilding. He couldn't allow that truth inside, so he exiled the vault's savior with a pistol, some supplies, and the Vault 13 jumpsuit he was wearing. The vault dweller walked north into the wasteland for the second time, and this time he didn't look back. He founded Arroyo in 2067, somewhere in Oregon, a village built by vault dwellers and tribals who'd never see their old homes again. Aradesh heard the story from a caravan master 6 months later and made a decision that would define Shady Sands' future. Aradesh announced the new policy at a town meeting in early 2163. Shady Sands would accept anyone willing to work the fields, guard the walls, or learn a trade. No background checks, no vault requisitions, no questions about where you came from or what you'd done before the war. You followed the town's laws, you contributed labor, you got a place to sleep, and a share of the harvest. The first arrivals were caravan guards who'd grown tired of the road, then farmers from settlements that had dried up or been overrun. By 2064, the population had doubled to around 240. Aradesh organized work crews to expand the Brahmin pens, dig new irrigation channels, and build a second row of housing outside the original walls. The town sprawled east into land that had been empty scrubland 2 years earlier. A ghoul mechanic named Rutger showed up in 2165 and built the settlement's first functional generator from pre-war salvage. A former Brotherhood scribe, excommunicated for reasons he never explained, taught 12 children to read using a water-damaged textbook he'd carried for 300 miles. Shady Sands wasn't just growing. It was diversifying in ways no other settlement in the region had managed. Not everyone who arrived came with good intentions. The Vipers were a raider cult that worshipped a goddess of venom and operated out of camps in the hills west of Shady Sands. In April 2165, they hit a caravan returning from Junktown, killed 3 guards, and made off with 400 pounds of grain and medical supplies. Aradesh assembled 18 volunteers, armed them with hunting rifles and the few laser pistols left from the vault dwellers' visit, and tracked the raiders back to their camp. The militia caught the Vipers at dawn, while half the camp was still asleep. The fight lasted 11 minutes. Shady Sands lost 2 people. The Vipers lost 14, including the cult leader's father, a man named Asp, who'd founded the group in 2155. The survivors scattered into the wasteland. Aradesh's people recovered most of the stolen supplies and returned home, believing they'd broken the Vipers for good. They hadn't. Asp's son, a raider who took the name Viper Lord, swore a blood oath in front of the remaining cult members. Shady Sands had killed his father, so Shady Sands would pay in kind. The Vipers rebuilt quietly over the next 18 months, recruiting from tribal villages and failed settlements, teaching new members to coat their blades with rad scorpion venom. The Vipers wouldn't forget, and their revenge would cost Shady Sands, the man who built it. Aradesh left for the hub on March 2, 2167, leading a delegation to negotiate a permanent trade agreement. The Vipers ambushed the group 17 miles south of Shady Sands. In a narrow canyon, the caravan route passed through twice a month. They killed all 6 guards in the initial volley, then dragged Aradesh into the rocks. His body was found 3 days later by a search party, throat cut, left in the open sun as a message. The town shut down for 4 days. No one worked the fields. No caravans left the gates. The market square stayed empty. Aradesh had led Shady Sands for 21 years, from 67 vault dwellers huddled behind a single wall to a settlement of over 300 with 4 trading partners and functioning infrastructure. People genuinely didn't know if the town could survive without him. The council called an emergency session to choose a successor. 3 candidates stepped forward, all men who'd served as Aradesh's advisors for years, each with their own faction, and their own vision for what Shady Sands should become. The debate lasted 6 hours and settled nothing. Then the council chamber door opened, and Tandy walked in wearing her father's coat. But the woman who stepped forward wasn't the leader anyone expected. At 37, Tandy wasn't the firebrand her father had been. She was quieter, more methodical. The council elected her by unanimous vote 3 days after Aradesh's funeral, and her first speech lasted exactly 4 minutes. She promised 2 things. First, Shady Sands would honor every treaty and friendship her father had built. Second, the town would never again rely on a single caravan route for survival. Within 6 months, she'd expanded the militia from 40 to 85, established a proper training rotation, and commissioned a weapons workshop. The council protested the cost until she pointed out that the Khans had scouts watching them from the hills every week. By 2169, Shady Sands had backup wells, a grain reserve that could feed the town for 8 months, and the beginning of a real school. Tandy taught history there, twice a week, using her father's journals. She'd spent 20 years watching her father build a town. She intended to build something much larger. The expansion started small. In 2170, Shady Sands opened trade with a farming settlement 18 miles south. By 2172, there were 5 allied villages in regular contact, sharing crop yields and warning each other about raider movements. The population inside Shady Sands itself hit 2,000 in 2074. New neighborhoods sprawled beyond the original walls, forcing the construction of a proper perimeter that took 9 months to complete. The school added 2 teachers and started offering basic medical training. Tandy's real innovation came in 2775, when she proposed a mutual defense pact. Any settlement that signed would contribute militia members to a shared force, commanded by rotating leadership. It was voluntary, non-binding, and carefully designed not to threaten anyone's independence. 7 settlements signed in the first year. The shared patrols cleared 3 raider camps and rescued 2 caravans. It worked because nobody was forced, nobody gave up control, and the threats were real enough that cooperation made sense. The push toward true unification came from the east, and it wore power armor. The Brotherhood of Steel had occupied the Lost Hills bunker since before the bombs fell. By the 2170s, they were a technological fortress, sitting on pre-war weapons, power armor, and energy cells that could vaporize a deathclaw in 3 seconds. Their policy was simple: stay hidden, hoard technology, avoid outsiders. Brotherhood patrols occasionally crossed paths with Shady Sands traders, and the encounters followed a pattern. The traders stared at the armor. The Brotherhood said nothing. Everyone moved on. To wastelanders, the Brotherhood were ghosts in steel. They didn't raid, didn't trade, didn't talk. Rumors said they had libraries, machine shops, and enough firepower to level a city. Nobody knew if the rumors were true because nobody got inside. Tandy had tried diplomatic contact twice. Both times, Brotherhood patrols politely informed her that the Brotherhood had no interest in surface politics. That stance held for 6 years, until necessity forced both sides to the table. The meeting that would define their relationship for decades came down to a broken water pump and a desperate mayor. The negotiations took 11 days. High Elder John Maxon brought 3 scribes and a security detail. Tandy brought maps, crop projections, and a blunt assessment of what both sides needed to survive. The agreement was straightforward. Shady Sands would supply food, textiles, and civilian labor for maintenance projects the Brotherhood couldn't spare personnel for. In return, the Brotherhood would provide technical advisors, limited medical technology, and military support against organized raider threats. The arrangement satisfied no one completely. Maxon faced criticism from isolationist elders who saw any surface entanglement as a betrayal of Brotherhood principles. Tandy's council worried they were trading independence for protection, becoming a client state in all but name. Both leaders signed anyway. The Maxon Accords went into effect on March 14, 2176, with a 5-year term and provisions for renegotiation. For the first time since the war, a major military power and a civilian settlement had formalized mutual obligations. The first test of the alliance came faster than either side anticipated. The Vipers had been quiet for 6 years, scattered into the southern wastes after their defeat. In early 2177, a new leader emerged, a former raid captain who claimed visions from the Great Serpent. His message was simple: the settlements were an abomination, civilization itself an offense against the wasteland. By summer, coordinated Viper attacks hit 4 settlements in 3 weeks. They weren't raids for supplies anymore. They were extermination runs. Caravans stopped moving. Outlying farms were abandoned. Every report Tandy received painted the same picture: larger groups, better organized, moving with purpose toward Shady Sands. She invoked the Maxon Accords on August 20. The Brotherhood response arrived 6 days later, a full lance of 12 knights in T-51B power armor, led by Paladin Rhombus himself. The Vipers hit Shady Sands' southern approach on August 19, with over 200 raiders, the largest coordinated attack the town had ever faced. The Battle of Shady Sands' south wall would leave 300 dead and prove that cooperation could work. Brotherhood Knights held the center, while Shady Sands militia covered the flanks and rooftops. The fighting lasted 7 hours. Laser rifles and power armor broke the initial charge, but it was coordinated fire from militia marksmen that prevented the Vipers from flanking. When the raider line finally collapsed, pursuit teams tracked survivors for 3 days. The cult never recovered. Without their leader, who died in the first volley, the Vipers fractured back into isolated bands. Southern trade routes reopened by October. Shady Sands lost 43 defenders. The Brotherhood lost 2 knights, including Rhombus, who took a spear through a joint seal while protecting wounded militia. The funerals were held together. Maxon attended personally and stayed for the memorial. In private conversations with Tandy, both acknowledged what the casualty lists made clear: no single settlement, no matter how well defended, could withstand the wasteland alone. Defense required scale, coordination, shared resources. Tandy used the victory to ask a question no one in the wasteland had seriously considered for a century. What she proposed in 2178 sounded simple on paper: 5 settlements, 1 federation, a council where each town sent representatives to vote on shared laws, mutual defense pacts, coordinated caravans, a unified currency backed by Hub water and Shady Sands grain. The Hub's water merchants saw profit in stable trade routes. Junktown's council liked the idea of not fighting raiders alone, but Adietam's leadership called it a power grab, convinced Shady Sands wanted to tax their scrapyards. The Boneyards gangs laughed the proposal out of the room. Tandy spent 11 months traveling between settlements, negotiating terms, rewriting clauses, convincing town leaders that a republic didn't mean surrendering autonomy. Some wanted veto power. Others demanded military command stay local. A few asked why they should trust a 19-year-old woman with no formal education to build a government. 2 towns signed immediately. 1 refused outright and paid the price within a year. On April 12, 2189, representatives from 5 settlements gathered in Shady Sands Council Hall. Shady Sands, the Hub, Junktown, Dayglow, and Maxontown. Not the 5 Tandy originally approached, but the 5 willing to sign a provisional constitution that ran 47 pages and left half the hard questions unanswered. The first council session lasted 6 hours. They voted on a flag, a name, the structure of the president's term. Tandy won the election 22-3, the youngest head of state the wasteland had seen since before the bombs. She gave a 4-minute speech about shared survival, then immediately proposed a tax on caravan profits to fund a standing army. The hub's delegates walked out. It took 3 days of closed-door bargaining to bring them back, and the compromise left the military question unresolved for another 2 years. But the new California Republic existed, a nation built on trade routes, water rights, and the belief that cooperation beat isolation. The Republic existed on paper, but half the wastes still thought it would collapse before the year ended. Junktown's mayor died in January 2190. No heir, no succession plan. 2 merchant families, the Stouts and the Killians, both claimed authority. The Stouts controlled the casino and the gate guards. The Killians owned the general store and the water contract. By February, both sides had armed enforcers patrolling their blocks. Junktown's council rep sent a message to Shady Sands. Armed standoff, looting spreading, request NCR peacekeepers. The hub's delegates argued the Republic had no legal right to interfere in a member state's internal politics. Dayglow's rep pointed out that if Junktown collapsed into gang war, it set a precedent that the NCR couldn't protect its own members. Tandy faced a choice with no good answer. Send troops, and critics would call it federal overreach, an invasion disguised as peacekeeping. Do nothing, and the Republic's first member state tears itself apart while the NCR watches. For 9 days, the council debated jurisdiction, state sovereignty, whether a federation meant anything if it couldn't act. Tandy's choice would define whether the NCR was a federation or an empire, and she chose the harder path. She sent 47 rangers. Not soldiers, rangers. Their orders were explicit. Protect civilians, secure the trade routes, but do not choose a side. No weapons to either faction, no political endorsements, no attempt to install a government Shady Sands preferred. In Junktown, both Gizmo's supporters and Killian's merchants expected the NCR to back their guy. Instead, the Rangers set up checkpoints between the fighting districts and told everyone to put the guns down or leave. It was the most restrained show of force the young Republic could manage, and it made almost nobody happy. Hawks in the council called it weakness. Isolationists called it the first step toward empire. Tandy's answer to both groups was the same. The NCR didn't join Junktown's war because Junktown wasn't at war with the NCR. The Rangers stayed for 23 days. The shooting stopped on day 11. The lesson wasn't about force. It was about patience and knowing when to let people solve their own problems. On day 18, Killian Darkwater and Gizmo's lieutenant worked out a power-sharing agreement with an NCR observer in the room, but not at the table. Gizmo's casinos stayed open under new regulations. Killian's militia became the town guard, with oversight from an elected council that included both factions. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even particularly fair, but it was local, it was voluntary, and it worked. The Rangers stayed another 5 days to make sure the agreement held, then left 8 behind as observers. No occupation, no annexation, no NCR governor installed over the heads of people who'd just spent 3 weeks shooting at each other. The Junktown Compromise became the blueprint. For the next 6 years, every time a settlement asked to join the NCR or requested intervention, the same model applied. Limited peacekeeping, local solutions, NCR oversight only as long as needed. It was slow, it was messy, and it built trust in a way conquest never could. But while the NCR learned diplomacy in the West, a new threat was growing in the East. By 2192, the territory east of NCR land wasn't empty. It was a patchwork of raider kingdoms, dozens of them, each controlling a few miles of wasteland and a water source. Former Khans who never made it north, Viper survivors. The Jackals, a new group that made the Vipers look civilized. None of them were organized, none of them worked together, and that's exactly what made them survivable. Ranger patrols counted at least 40 distinct groups between the eastern NCR border and the Mojave. Most were 15 to 60 fighters, hitting caravans, taking slaves, disappearing into the rocks when the Rangers showed up. They weren't a threat to the Republic. They were a cost of doing business, written into every trader's budget as acceptable losses. The NCR's eastern strategy was containment, fortified the border, escorted the big caravans, let the raiders fight each other over scraps. It worked because raiders don't build, they take, and when there's nothing left to take, they starve or move on. For 3 years, that logic held. Reports started coming in of something different, raiders who weren't just raiding anymore. The Great Khans weren't gone, they'd just scattered. By 2191, survivors from the original tribe started regrouping in the eastern wastes, this time under a leader named Garl Deathhand. They fortified positions in the hills, absorbed smaller gangs, and built something closer to an actual army than a raiding party. NCR scouts brought back reports that made the council nervous. The Khans were drilling, training, setting up supply lines. They'd learned from their defeat, and they weren't repeating the mistakes that got them wiped out in Shady Sands. For 2 years, the NCR watched and waited, debating whether this was a threat or just another gang putting on a show. Then the pattern changed. Khans hit caravans with precision timing, knew patrol routes before they were finalized, disappeared before reinforcements arrived. They weren't raiding for survival anymore. They were preparing for something bigger. The war began over water. It always does in the wastes. In March 2195, the Great Khans seized Bitter Springs, a natural oasis 80 miles east of NCR territory. It wasn't much, just a few wells and some scrub, but those wells fed 3 settlements and half a dozen caravan routes. The Khans dug in, fortified the high ground, and made it clear they weren't leaving. Tondi authorized military force, not rangers, not militias. The first formal units of the NCR Army, 240 soldiers with standardized weapons and actual uniforms. They marched east in April, surrounded Bitter Springs in May, and gave the Khans 24 hours to withdraw. The Khans refused. The battle lasted 6 hours. NCR artillery, salvaged from pre-war stockpiles and jury-rigged back to function, shelled the Khans' positions until they broke. 78 Khans died, 11 NCR soldiers. The Republic held the springs by sunset, and the water was flowing again within a week. The victory was clean, too clean, and it taught the NCR the wrong lessons. Bitter Springs proved something the NCR had suspected for years. Organized military force could pacify the wastes. Within 6 months, the council formalized the expansion doctrine. Any territory without legitimate governance could be annexed for the protection of its inhabitants. Raider elimination became liberation. Military deployment became civic duty. The army grew from 240 soldiers to over 1,200 by 2197. New forts went up every few months, each one a day's march from the last, each one flying the two-headed bear. Settlements that had spent decades fighting off raiders suddenly had NCR patrols, NCR laws, and NCR taxes. Most of them celebrated. The core territories loved it, safe behind an expanding buffer of pacified land. Tondi framed every push east as a moral imperative, and the public bought it. The wastes could be civilized, the Republic could grow. The costs, fuel, ammunition, soldiers' lives, were acceptable because the cause was just. By 2199, the NCR had tripled its territory in 4 years. Every mile east brought new settlements under the NCR flag, but not all of them volunteered. The official policy was voluntary incorporation. Settlements could petition to join, hold a referendum, sign the treaty. But when NCR Rangers arrived in a frontier town to offer membership, they also mentioned the alternatives. Without NCR protection, you were on your own against the raiders. Without NCR trade routes, your merchants would bypass you. Without NCR law, disputes with neighboring towns had no arbiter. Most settlements signed. A few hesitated and found NCR troops stationed just outside their borders, waiting. In 2197, the farming commune of Quincy refused the treaty 3 times. On the 4th visit, NCR soldiers entered the town hall during the vote. The final tally was unanimous. No shots were fired. The justifications were consistent. The NCR brought medicine, infrastructure, protection from the wasteland's horrors. Membership meant survival. Refusing meant gambling with your children's lives. By 2200, only the most isolated or heavily defended settlements remained independent, and the Senate in Shady Sands debated whether isolation itself was a threat to regional stability. While the Republic grew outward, its capital was transforming into something unrecognizable. Shady Sands in 2200 bore almost no resemblance to the Brahmin village Aradesh had founded. The population had crossed 10,000. 2-story buildings lined paved streets. The wealthy districts near the old vault entrance had running water pumped from underground cisterns, glass windows salvaged from old-world ruins, even a few working street lamps powered by the grid. The presidential mansion occupied 3 pre-war buildings, welded together with steel plating and concrete, its walls thick enough to stop small arms fire. Merchant caravans arrived daily, from as far as the Boneyard and Dayglow, their Brahmin carts loaded with scrap, weapons, pre-war luxuries. Prospectors flooded in from annexed territories, spending their salvage money in the expanding market district. Refugees came too, families fleeing raider attacks, farmers whose wells had run dry, traders chasing opportunity. The city sprawled outward in unplanned clusters of sheet metal and concrete, new neighborhoods appearing every month. By late 2200, construction crews were working on a 4th expansion of the outer wall. Tandy's speeches called it the jewel of the New World, proof that civilization could be rebuilt from ash. But the city's growth had created 2 Shady Sands, and the gap between them was widening every year. The center belonged to the vault-descended families and the merchant dynasties who'd arrived early. Their children attended the Republic's first formal school. Their homes had electricity 6 hours a day. They debated philosophy in the assembly hall, where Tandy's father had once welcomed the vault dweller, and complained about crime in the outer districts, ruining the neighborhood. The edges belonged to everyone else. Wastelanders packed into tenements with 8 families sharing a single water pump. Day laborers from annexed towns who spoke different dialects and worshipped different gods. Refugees who'd lost everything and arrived with nothing. The NCR had laws about property rights and contracts, but enforcing them required lawyers, and lawyers cost caps the outer districts didn't have. Crime followed the divide. Theft, extortion, the occasional killing over water or food. The Rangers focused on external threats, the raider kingdoms and hostile creatures. Internal security fell to a stretched town guard that rarely patrolled past the middle districts. Tandy pushed for reforms, worker protections, subsidized housing. The Senate debated them for months, passed watered-down versions, funded them poorly. The bubble burst over something as simple as bread prices, and it nearly tore the capital apart. The drought hit hard in 2002. The aquifer that fed Shady Sands dropped 3 meters in 6 months. Crops withered in the fields, and speculators saw an opportunity. Merchants began hoarding grain, waiting for prices to climb. By August, a loaf of bread cost 3 times what it had in spring. The outer districts erupted first, markets looted, warehouses burned, and for 3 days, the NCR's capital teetered on the edge of collapse. Tandy deployed troops to restore order, but she knew force alone wouldn't solve this. Emergency price controls went into effect within a week. The Senate grumbled, merchants threatened to withhold supply, but Tandy held firm. Food started moving again, the fires died down, and the city slowly exhaled. Tandy realized that expansion meant nothing if the capital couldn't feed itself. The solution was radical for the wasteland. In 2203, the Republic committed $4.07 million caps to agriculture. Engineers surveyed the entire Central Valley, mapping old irrigation canals and planning new ones. Pre-war seed vaults near Modoc were cracked open, their contents cataloged and distributed to farmers willing to relocate. The government founded 12 agricultural settlements between 2204 and 2207, offering land grants, tools, and 2 years of subsidized water. Brahmin herds were bred selectively for the first time in generations. By 2208, grain yields had doubled, and Shady Sands had strategic food reserves for the first time in its history. The work continued through 2210. Canals dug, pumps installed, entire towns built around farming. The NCR became the breadbasket of the wasteland, exporting food as far as the Mojave. Shady Sands stabilized, prices dropped, and the bread riots became a memory. The fields were green again, but no one thought to ask what that much farming would do to the water table. Between 2205 and 2215, Shady Sands reached heights the wasteland hadn't seen in 130 years. The population hit 25,000. Streets were lit at night by functioning electric lamps, and clean water ran through pipes instead of being hauled in barrels. Schools opened in every district, a functioning hospital trained doctors, and in 2209, the Republic founded its first university. Tandy governed through it all, re-elected term after term, with margins that bordered on unanimous. She was 70 years old in 2210 and showed no signs of slowing. The Senate respected her, the military trusted her, and the people loved her. For a decade, the Republic worked. Trade routes were safe, Brahmin caravans moved freely, and citizens could plan for a future beyond survival. Shady Sands felt less like a wasteland settlement and more like a city, something built to last. Tandy would govern the Republic for another 25 years, but the Golden Age wouldn't last nearly that long. In 2215, NCR Rangers started filing reports from the northern frontier that didn't make sense. Power armor more advanced than anything the Brotherhood possessed. Aircraft, actual working vertibirds, something California hadn't seen fly in over a century. Scattered references to a coastal base, genetic screening, and a phrase that kept appearing: pre-war purity. The intelligence came from traitors, deserters, the occasional dead soldier wearing insignia no one recognized. NCR Command thought it was Brotherhood propaganda at first, some kind of disinformation campaign, but the reports kept coming, from sources with no reason to coordinate lies. Someone out there had pre-war technology that made the Brotherhood look like scavengers. By 2220, the pattern was clear enough to brief President Tandy directly. An organization called the Enclave, military structure, advanced weapons, and a doctrine that treated wastelanders as genetically contaminated. They weren't raiders or tribals. They were organized, disciplined, and they'd been operating in the shadows for decades, while the NCR built its republic. The truth was worse than anyone imagined, a surviving fragment of the old government, and they had a plan for the wasteland. The stranger who walked into NCR territory in 2241 didn't look like much. Tribal leathers, a spear, the kind of wastelander the Republic saw 100 times a week. But this one was different. Grandchild of the Vault Dweller, sent from Arroyo with a single mission: find a GECK, a Garden of Eden creation kit, the pre-war terraforming device that could save a dying village. NCR Rangers encountered the Chosen One multiple times over the next year. Vault City, the Den, New Reno, always moving, always one step ahead of something. The reports painted a picture of someone with the Vault Dwellers' luck and twice the problems. Enclave patrols were tracking them. Abductions were happening in frontier towns, people disappearing in vertibird raids, and the Chosen One kept showing up wherever the Enclave operated. By mid-2242, the situation escalated beyond reconnaissance. The Enclave wasn't just observing anymore. They were mobilizing, moving assets, preparing for something big. The Chosen One had found their base, a massive oil rig off the coast, Poseidon Energy's old platform converted into a fortress. NCR intel tracked the tribal heading straight for it, alone, with no backup and no clear exit strategy. The battle that decided the region's future happened offshore, and when the smoke cleared, the Enclave was gone. October 2242. The Poseidon oil rig detonated with enough force to register on seismographs in Shady Sands. The Chosen One had infiltrated the platform, fought through Enclave security, and triggered a reactor overload that vaporized the entire structure. The Enclave's president, their command staff, their research division, all of it went up in a fireball, visible from the mainland. 2 centuries of continuity of government planning ended in a single afternoon. Enclave operations across California collapsed within weeks. Outposts went silent. Patrols stopped. The vertibirds that had terrorized the frontier simply vanished. NCR rangers found abandoned equipment, half-destroyed bases, evidence of a rapid evacuation east. Some survived, clearly, but the organization that had lurked in California's shadows was effectively eliminated as a regional power. What the NCR found, washed ashore over the following months, changed everything. Power armor fragments, energy weapon schematics, vertibird components, medical technology, a century beyond anything the Brotherhood had shared. Salvage teams worked the debris field for 2 years, recovering enough pre-war military hardware to fill warehouses in Shady Sands. The Republic had never possessed anything close to this level of firepower. The wreckage that washed ashore held prizes that would make the NCR a true military power and sow the seeds of future wars. The best finds came from the oil rig's armory levels. Power armor frames designed for the Enclave's advanced X-02 series. Plasma weapons with efficiency ratings 3 times higher than anything the Brotherhood possessed. Vertibird schematics complete enough to reverse engineer. Medical autodocs that could perform surgery without a human doctor, environmental suits that could filter radiation for weeks, tactical computers that still held pre-war combat algorithms. NCR engineers set up a research facility in Shady Sands, working in 12-hour shifts to decode Enclave technology. By 2244, they'd produced their first salvaged power armor prototype. It was crude compared to the original, jury-rigged from 3 different frames. But it worked. The Republic could now field armored troops without begging the Brotherhood for hand-me-downs. The Brotherhood watched this with growing alarm. For 80 years, they'd maintained technological superiority through careful hoarding. Now their oldest ally was building an arsenal that could match theirs. Using knowledge the Brotherhood had spent decades keeping secret. Elder Maxon sent warnings to Shady Sands, reminders of old agreements about controlling dangerous technology. Tandy sent polite replies and kept building. The partnership that had built the Republic was fraying, and the Brotherhood was starting to see the NCR as a threat. The first real confrontation came in 2245. NCR prospectors found a cache of laser rifles near Dayglow, well within Republic borders. A Brotherhood patrol arrived 3 days later and claimed the weapons under their technology preservation mandate. The NCR garrison commander refused. Both sides drew weapons. Both sides backed down. But the message was clear. Over the next 2 years, similar incidents multiplied. Brotherhood scribes demanded access to NCR research facilities, were denied, and filed formal complaints. NCR citizens began calling the Brotherhood parasites, living off Republic protection, while hoarding knowledge that could save lives. Brotherhood paladins started referring to NCR troops as primitives, playing with tools they couldn't understand. Tandy tried to mediate, proposing joint research councils and technology sharing agreements. The Brotherhood's High Elder rejected every proposal. Their position hadn't changed since 2161. Advanced technology in the wrong hands had destroyed the world once, and they wouldn't let it happen again. The NCR's position was simpler. This was their country, their salvage, their right to defend themselves, however they saw fit. By 2248, Brotherhood patrols and NCR military units operated in the same regions without speaking to each other. The breaking point came when an NCR patrol found a bunker the Brotherhood had kept secret for 60 years. The bunker sat 15 miles south of Shady Sands, hidden under what looked like collapsed highway overpass. NCR engineers discovered it while surveying for a new rail line in 2231. Inside they found weapons, armor, medical supplies, and a Brotherhood garrison that had been there since 2171. The Republic had built roads around it, established settlements within sight of it, never knowing it existed. Tandy demanded an explanation. The Brotherhood refused to provide one. 3 months later, NCR troops surrounded the bunker and ordered the garrison to leave Republic territory. The Brotherhood sent reinforcements. What followed wasn't a war in the traditional sense, more a decade of skirmishes over who controlled pre-war military sites within NCR borders. The Brotherhood held every tactical advantage. Their power armor shrugged off NCR small arms fire. Their energy weapons cut through cover like paper. Their training made them worth 10 regular soldiers each. But the NCR had numbers. For every bunker the Brotherhood defended, the Republic found 3 more and stripped them before paladins could arrive. For every NCR squad wiped out, 2 more replaced them. Most engagements lasted minutes. Brotherhood paladins would appear, eliminate resistance, secure the site. NCR forces would fall back, regroup, and return with enough troops to make holding the position too costly. Neither side pushed for total war. Both sides bled slowly. The war ground on for a decade, then a single battle changed everything. Helios 1 sat on a ridge overlooking the Mojave, a pre-war solar power plant fortified by Brotherhood engineers into something close to a fortress. The NCR command believed numbers would be enough. On March 18, 2242, they sent 3 full battalions up the slope in a coordinated assault, expecting the Brotherhood's 50 defenders to fold under the weight. The Brotherhood had spent 6 months turning every approach into a kill zone. Automated turrets, minefields, interlocking fields of fire from bunker positions, the NCR scouts had missed entirely. The attack stalled within 200 meters of the perimeter. When NCR officers ordered the retreat, panic set in among the ranks. What should have been an organized fallback became a rout down the hillside. Brotherhood knights in power armor pursued the fleeing troops for 3 kilometers, cutting down anyone too slow to reach the rally point. The NCR left 107 dead on the field. Another 240 wounded made it back to camp, many of whom wouldn't survive the week. The Brotherhood lost 4 paladins. Tandy herself attended the memorial service in Shady Sands, standing beside the flag-draped coffins while families wept. The press called it the single worst defeat in NCR military history. The NCR lost the battle, but the Brotherhood's victory would prove hollow within 5 years. After Helios, the NCR General Staff stopped trying to take Brotherhood positions by force. Instead, they drew lines on a map around every known bunker and outpost, then slowly tightened the noose. Patrols interdicted supply caravans. Rangers marked every entrance and exit. No convoys in, no scavenging parties out. The Brotherhood controlled perhaps 40 square kilometers of territory in 2245. By 2247, that had shrunk to 12. By 2249, They held Lost Hills and 3 fortified bunkers, all of them cut off from each other, all of them running low on food, ammunition, and replacement parts for aging power armor. The NCR forces didn't storm the gates. They didn't need to. They built checkpoints, ran patrols, and waited. Brotherhood scribes began rationing water at 1.5 liters per day. Knights went on half rations to keep the tech staff fed. Every few months, a small team would try to break the blockade for supplies. Most didn't come back. Elder Maxon died in 2249, and his successor inherited a dying chapter. The younger paladins wanted to fight their way out. The scribes ran the numbers and explained there was nowhere to go. By 2250, the Brotherhood of Steel was starving in their bunkers, and the NCR offered terms they couldn't refuse. The Treaty of Lost Hills was signed on April 9, 2251, in a bunker conference room lit by salvaged glow rods. The Brotherhood retained sovereignty over Lost Hills and 2 additional bunkers. In exchange, they agreed to provide technological advisors to NCR military R&D, train NCR engineers in power armor maintenance, and formally recognize NCR authority over all disputed territory. It was a surrender, dressed up in diplomatic language. The Brotherhood went from a major regional power to a protectorate in a single document. NCR officials called it a fair compromise. Brotherhood paladins called it a humiliation. Both sides signed because the alternative was worse. The NCR gained access to technology they'd been trying to reverse engineer for 15 years. The Brotherhood gained breathing room, food shipments, and the guarantee that their chapter would survive. Tandy personally brokered the final terms, walking the line between her military's demand for total victory and her pragmatic understanding that crushing the Brotherhood entirely would cost thousands more lives. The treaty held because both sides needed it to. Brotherhood advisors reported to NCR bases, taught courses on energy weapons and advanced electronics, and quietly resented every minute. NCR soldiers kept their distance from the remaining Brotherhood bunkers, wary of reigniting the conflict. The peace lasted almost 20 years, until a new generation of Brotherhood leadership decided the terms were intolerable. By 2250, Tandy was in her 90s, and she'd long since stopped pretending she'd live forever. Her body slowed, but the mind stayed sharp, and she spent those final 2 decades less on borders and battles and more on paperwork most leaders find unbearably dull. She wanted the Republic to survive her, which meant strengthening the things that don't depend on any one person. She pushed hard on constitutional reform, tightening the powers of the council, clarifying how laws passed, defining what a president could and couldn't do without a vote. She expanded the courts, formalized the citizenship rules for annexed towns, and put real teeth behind elections that had, for years, mostly rubber-stamped her. It was quiet, careful work, the kind that doesn't make for good stories. She was building institutions strong enough to run without a legend at the center. But there was one problem she never fully solved, and everyone around her felt it growing. She'd governed the Republic for 80 years, and no one had seriously considered what would happen when she died. Tandy died in 2270, at 103 years old. The Republic she left behind stretched across hundreds of miles and dozens of towns, and for a few days, it had no idea what to do with itself. There was no clear heir, no obvious successor she'd groomed, just a council full of ambitious people who'd spent decades waiting in her shadow. Candidates surfaced almost immediately. Council members who'd built their own power bases, regional leaders from the Boneyard and the Hub and the northern farmlands, each backing someone who'd protect their interests. The old fear crept back into the conversation, the word nobody wanted to say out loud: civil war. An emergency session convened in Shady Sands, and the arguments ran for days. Every faction dug in, every vote deadlocked, and the Republic held its breath while the people who'd built it nearly tore it apart over who'd inherit it. In the end, exhaustion did what consensus couldn't. The compromise candidate was a hub merchant nobody expected to last a year, and she would go on to define the next era of the Republic. Joanna Tibbet won in 2271, and she won precisely because she was nobody's first choice. A pragmatic merchant out of the hub, she had no army behind her, no general whispering in her ear, no regional bloc counting on favors. The factions that couldn't agree on a strong candidate could all live with a weak one, and that turned out to be her greatest asset. She governed like a merchant because that's what she was. Instead of chasing new territory, she looked at the books, and she didn't like what she saw. Overextended trade routes, uneven taxes, towns that cost more to defend than they gave back. Her reforms focused inward, tightening the economy, standardizing the currency, making the republic that already existed actually work. It was a hopeful, grounded kind of leadership, the sort that trades glory for stability and quietly hopes nobody notices. For a while, nobody did. Her first year in office was calm, almost dull. The second year brought news of an army in the east. The reports started as rumors. Traders from Arizona spoke of a man who called himself Caesar, who'd conquered 87 tribes in 15 years and forged them into something the wasteland had never seen. Edward Sallow had been a follower of the apocalypse, a linguist studying tribal languages near the Grand Canyon. In 2246, he was captured by the Blackfoot tribe, and instead of dying, he taught them to win. By 2250, he'd rebuilt them as a Roman legion, complete with Latin names and Praetorian guards. By 2260, he controlled most of Arizona. By 2271, his territory stretched from the Grand Canyon to the edges of New Mexico, a slave empire of 3 million people built on conquest and crucifixion. The legion didn't occupy land, it erased cultures. Tribes weren't absorbed, they were unmade. NCR intelligence tracked legion movements from 2272 to 2275, watching the eastward campaigns, noting the discipline and the brutality. What they saw didn't worry them much. Caesar's forces were tribal melee fighters with machetes and football gear, no firearms worth mentioning, no industrial base. The Colorado River was 200 miles of natural barrier. The NCR assumed the legion would stop at the Colorado. The assumption cost them a city. Bullhead City fell on August 3, 2276. The legion crossed the river at night. 400 warriors in the first wave, another 800 behind them. The NCR garrison numbered 107 soldiers, most of them asleep when the assault began. By dawn, 92 were dead. The rest crucified along Highway 95, in a line that stretched 4 miles south. The crucifixions weren't combat, they were message. Travelers found NCR soldiers still alive on the crosses 3 days later, too weak to speak. Caesar's forces didn't hold Bullhead. They burned it and withdrew back across the river, leaving the bodies in place. The news reached Shady Sands on August 9th. For the first time since the Enclave, the Republic faced an enemy that could kill trained soldiers in open battle. The intelligence assessments changed overnight. Legion forces weren't tribal raiders. They were an army. 8,000 to 12,000 combat-ready troops, maybe more. Discipline that rivaled NCR regulars. A logistics network that could move thousands of men across desert without vehicles. And a commander who understood that terror was a strategic asset. Tibbet faced a choice: pull back to defensible positions or commit everything to holding the Colorado River. Hoover Dam made the choice for her. The dam generated 2,080 megawatts before the war, and NCR engineers had 3 of the 17 turbines running by 2,274. That was enough power for 50,000 homes, or the industrial facilities that kept the Republic's economy alive. Losing the dam meant losing electricity. Losing the Colorado meant losing the natural border that protected California from everything east. More than that, it meant losing the war before it started. If the Legion took Hoover, they'd have a fortress 700 feet high and 1,200 feet wide, with the river and the power both. The NCR would be fighting uphill against an enemy that controlled the high ground and the infrastructure. Tibbet committed 3 full battalions to the dam in October 2276, 1,890 soldiers, with orders to fortify and hold at any cost. The deployment stripped troops from the Boneyard, the Hub, and the Northern Territories. For the first time since Shady Sands was a village, the heartland was lightly defended. But the dam was the line. If it fell, the Legion would pour into Nevada, and Arizona would be the staging ground for an invasion of California itself. The fortifications went up through the winter. Machine gun nests on the towers, mines along the eastern approach, supply lines running back to Searchlight and Boulder City. The Legion hit Hoover Dam 8 months later. The first battle would decide whether the Republic survived. The Legion came at dawn on April 18, 2277. 6,200 legionaries hit the dam in a frontal wave, Caesar himself watching from the ridgeline. The NCR had 4,800 soldiers dug in, Ranger sharpshooters on the intake towers, artillery crews behind the visitor center. The fighting turned the dam's walkways into a slaughterhouse. NCR Rangers picked off Legion officers at 400 yards. Machete squads pushed through the barbed wire, only to hit mine fields and automatic fire. The legate, Joshua Graham, led the assault on the eastern spillway himself. He made it within 50 feet of the turbine hall before Ranger fire caught him, knocked him off the dam into the canyon below. The Legion broke. The battle lasted 9 hours. The NCR held the dam, killed or scattered most of the Legion force. But they'd lost 1,107 soldiers, another 2,300 wounded. Caesar pulled back across the river, regrouped in Arizona. The NCR held, but the cost was staggering, and back in Shady Sands, the victory felt hollow. Within 3 months, Shady Sands shifted to war production. The textile mills started making uniforms. The Crimson Caravan headquarters became a logistics center, coordinating weapons shipments east. President Kimball, elected in 2273 as a moderate, signed the War Powers Act in August 2277. It authorized conscription, rationing, factory conversions. By 2278, 14% of Shady Sands' working population was in uniform or making munitions. Brahmin meat got rationed to 2 pounds per household per week. The old NCR Mint ran triple shifts, stamping out helmets and canteens. Families started getting casualty letters. The first anti-war protests hit the plaza outside Congress. In January 2279, 400 people demanding their sons come home. The city kept producing. Production quotas went up every quarter. By 2280, Shady Sands was shipping 12,000 rounds of ammunition east every day, along with medical supplies, rations, replacement gear. The streets felt emptier. The city that had built a republic on cooperation was learning to run on fear, and some politicians knew how to use that. Aaron Kimball won the 2281 election by 19 points. He'd been a captain at the first battle, led the countercharge that retook the eastern checkpoint. Tall, square-jawed, good on camera. His campaign ran one message: total victory. No negotiation, no compromise. The Legion destroyed. It played well in Shady Sands, especially in the districts that had lost sons at the dam. Kimball took office in March 2281 and immediately tripled the military budget. He approved a second deployment to the Mojave, 8,000 fresh troops heading east. He promoted Oliver, the general who'd held Hoover, to supreme commander. He gave speeches about manifest destiny, about the NCR's responsibility to bring civilization to the wasteland. The Senate applauded. The crowds cheered. But the numbers didn't add up. The Republic was spending $43 million a year on the Mojave campaign, funding it with war bonds and deferred infrastructure. The eastern supply lines were 600 miles long, vulnerable, bleeding resources. Kimball didn't care. He'd promised the people a victory, and he was going to deliver one no matter the cost. Kimball promised to end the war, but instead, he would stretch the Republic to its breaking point. In early 2281, Kimball authorized the largest single deployment in NCR history. 15,000 troops poured into the Mojave, backed by supply convoys stretching 400 miles back to the hub. The Republic established forward operating bases at Camp Gulf, McCarran, and deep into contested territory at places like Forlorn Hope and Searchlight. Back in Shady Sands, the newspapers ran victory parades before a shot was fired. The Senate authorized another 8 billion caps for the war effort. Colonel Cassandra Moore was promoted to general and given operational command of the entire theater. The Rangers warned that the supply lines were vulnerable, that the Legion controlled the high ground east of the Colorado, that spreading 15,000 troops across dozens of outposts meant none of them could reinforce each other quickly. Kimball's staff ignored them. This was the modern NCR military, not some caravan guard outfit. For 3 months, it looked like the optimists were right. The NCR consolidated control over Highway 95, fortified Boulder City, and pushed Legion scouts back across the river. Then summer came, and the ambushes started. The Legion didn't meet the NCR head-on this time. They bled them slowly, one outpost at a time. The Legion had learned from First Hoover. Instead of massing for a single assault, they sent small raiding parties, 6 to 12 legionaries, hitting NCR patrols at dawn and disappearing into the hills. They poisoned water sources. They burned supply depots. They left the bodies where the next patrol would find them. Camp Searchlight fell to radiation sabotage in July 2281. 9-7 troopers dead or turned feral. Nipton was wiped out a month later, the entire town crucified as a message. Nelson was overrun in September, the garrison slaughtered and hung from crosses visible from Camp Forlorn Hope. The casualty reports arrived in Shady Sands every week. 23 dead in an ambush near Cottonwood Cove, 41 missing, presumed captured near the fort, 16 Rangers killed trying to hold Ranger Station Charlie. The numbers weren't catastrophic by themselves, but they never stopped. Kimball kept sending reinforcements. Moore kept requesting more troops. The Senate kept appropriating emergency war funds, while tax revenue from California's farms dropped because labor was in uniform instead of the fields. The Mojave wasn't producing nearly enough to cover its own cost. By late 2281, the NCR was spending more caps and lives every month than the Mojave was worth, and Caesar knew it. In 2282, Caesar forced the issue. The Second Battle of Hoover Dam wasn't one the NCR chose. It was one they couldn't avoid. The Legion massed forces at the fort, visible across the river, while NCR intelligence reported Legion hit squads moving toward Camp McCarran and the dam itself. General Oliver personally took command at Hoover, consolidating NCR forces behind the dam's defenses and leaving the eastern outposts dangerously exposed. Kimball flew to the dam to oversee the battle himself, despite explicit warnings from Ranger Ghost that Legion assassins were in the area. The entire command structure was committed. What happened next depended on variables the Republic couldn't control. A courier, if one existed, might tip the balance. Mr. House's Securitrons, if they were activated. The boomers at Nellis, if they could be convinced. The Brotherhood, if they weren't too busy being hunted. But those were unknowns. What Shady Sands knew for certain was this. 10 years after Kimball took office, the NCR had spent 40 billion caps, committed a quarter of its standing military, and sacrificed thousands of citizens for control of a single stretch of river. The city had transformed itself into a war machine to win the Mojave. The battle would decide who controlled Hoover, but the war had already decided what the NCR had become. By 2282, Shady Sands had become a city of 50,000 living under permanent mobilization. Ration cards determined who ate what. Military parades marched down Hub Boulevard every Sunday. Propaganda posters lined the avenues, declaring the Mojave Campaign a righteous crusade for democracy and electricity. The Assembly passed the Wartime Production Act, redirecting 60% of industrial output to military materiel. Factories that once made farming equipment now stamped out ammunition. The queues outside recruitment offices stretched 3 blocks. Dissenters found their businesses audited, their permits delayed, their names appearing on watch lists maintained by the Office of Strategic Intelligence. In the capital, senators spoke of manifest destiny and the NCR's civilizing mission. In the Mojave, troopers dug shallow graves in the sand and rationed ammunition because supply convoys kept disappearing on Highway 95. The distance between those two realities grew wider every month, and nobody in Shady Sands wanted to measure it. The city had become great, certainly. It commanded armies, minted currency, projected power across 700,000 square miles. But the question we started with wasn't just how Shady Sands rose. It's what that rise cost, and whether the city that emerged was the one Aradesh and Tandy dreamed of. October 2281. The Second Battle of Hoover Dam lasted 19 hours. One courier, carrying a platinum chip and a list of choices, decided the outcome. The NCR held the dam in some timelines, lost it in others, brokered an independent Vegas in a few. What mattered to Shady Sands wasn't which ending happened. It was that one person's actions could rewrite a decade of planning. The reports filtered back slowly. President Kimball survived an assassination attempt, or he didn't. General Oliver secured the dam, or he retreated in disgrace. Ambassador Crocker negotiated terms with Mr. House, or the Lucky 38 went dark forever. Every courier's path carved a different future, and the Senate spent 8 months arguing over intelligence briefs that contradicted each other. What shook Shady Sands wasn't losing or winning. It was realizing the NCR's vast bureaucratic machinery, its armies and its caps, could be outmaneuvered by a single actor operating outside institutional control. The factions inside the Assembly that had always distrusted expansion seized the moment. The hawks who demanded total victory found themselves explaining why 40 billion caps hadn't guaranteed it. The capital fractured along old fault lines, isolationists versus imperialists, reformers versus hardliners, those who believed Shady Sands' greatness lay in its values, versus those who measured it in territory. But while diplomats argued over maps in the capital, something far older was stirring in the Mojave's ruins. The NCR's Office of Science and Industry had maintained a file on Robert Edwin House since 2274. What they learned terrified them. A pre-war genius, 261 years old, sustained by technologies the NCR couldn't replicate. A man who'd predicted the Great War to the day, saved Las Vegas with a missile defense grid, and slept through 200 years of chaos to rebuild his city exactly as planned. House's New Vegas operated on principles Shady Sands couldn't accept. Autocracy, total information control, a vision of humanity's future, authored by one immortal mind. Yet it worked. The Strip generated more revenue per square mile than anywhere in the NCR. Crime stayed contained. The lights never went out. Ambassador Crocker's classified assessments posed the question nobody wanted to answer. What if House's model was more efficient than democracy? The Senate Intelligence Committee reviewed the files in closed session. House represented everything the NCR opposed, yet he'd achieved what Kimball's war machine couldn't. He'd made the wasteland prosperous, without mass mobilization, propaganda, or blood. Some senators saw him as a rival to be eliminated. Others saw him as proof that Shady Sands' expansion had been a mistake from the start, chasing an empire when it should have perfected the republic. The debate consumed the Capitol through late 2281 and into 2282. Negotiate with House or depose him. Annex Vegas or recognize its independence. Admit the NCR had overreached or double down on manifest destiny. And then the reports from the Strip stopped arriving entirely. For 19 days, nothing. Radio silence from every NCR operative embedded in the Strip, every Ranger team shadowing the dam, every forward observer watching the Legion's eastern camps. The emergency Senate session convened at midnight on day 3. By day 7, families were holding vigils outside the Hall of Congress. The worst-case scenarios circulated in whispers. Caesar had broken through. The dam had fallen. Every NCR soldier in the Mojave was dead or captured, and Legion war parties were already sweeping west toward the Boneyard. President Kimball ordered a general mobilization of reserve units across the core territories on day 11. Shady Sands had never felt so far from the frontier. The city that had built its identity on expansion, on pushing the borders of civilization ever outward, suddenly couldn't see past the horizon, couldn't reach the army it had sent to hold its most valuable prize. When the first survivors finally staggered back across the Long 15, they brought a story no one in Shady Sands was prepared to hear. The Second Battle of Hoover Dam lasted 11 hours. The NCR held the western side, barely, after brutal close-quarters fighting that turned the visitor center into a charnel house and left entire Ranger squads dead in the intake towers. General Oliver's defensive line buckled twice. The Legion's legate pushed to within 200 meters of the control room before NCR artillery from the Nevada side finally broke the assault. By nightfall on October 19, 2281, the dam was still NCR territory, but 1,247 NCR soldiers were confirmed dead, another 890 missing, and the entire eastern approach was a killing field the Republic couldn't hold without another full division, which it didn't have. Oliver ordered a fighting withdrawal to defensive positions 6 miles west, ceding everything the NCR had died for east of the dam. The dispatches reached Shady Sands on October 23rd. Technical victory, strategic disaster. The Mojave campaign, 6 years and 11 billion caps invested, had secured exactly one hydroelectric dam the NCR now had to defend, with a depleted, demoralized army, against an enemy that had just proven it could match the Republic's best troops in open battle. But the real cost wouldn't appear on any casualty list. The Senate floor erupted before the casualty reports were even fully compiled. Senator Patricia Grimes, of the Hub, demanded immediate withdrawal, citing logistics reports showing the Mojave garrison now consumed 34% of the entire military budget, while securing a territory that generated less than 8% of NCR tax revenue. General Cassandra Moore, freshly promoted and newly seated as military liaison, called retreat a betrayal of every soldier who died holding that dam. The economics block presented spreadsheets. The Mojave had cost the NCR 4,200 dead, 11 billion caps, and had destabilized trade across the entire western frontier. The Frontier Hawks presented maps. Pull back now, and the Legion would be in California within 5 years. President Kimball, facing re-election in 9 months, refused to commit to either position. The debate raged for 40 days. Every intellectual in Shady Sands had an opinion. The university published 17 competing strategic analyses. Protests outside the Hall of Congress turned violent twice. The vote was scheduled for December 8th, delayed to the 15th, then delayed again, as senators scrambled for compromise language that could survive the chamber. And while they debated, the caravans stopped coming. The merchant quarter noticed first. Brahmin caravans that had run the long 15 on 48-hour schedules stopped arriving. The steel shipments from Black Mountain salvage yards, the tool parts from New Vegas workshops, the purified water contracts from Lake Mead, all of it simply ended. Within 3 weeks, prices on basic goods doubled in Shady Sands markets. The NCR had spent 15 years weaving the Mojave into its supply network. Half the capital's industrial district ran on components manufactured in Vegas foundries. The municipal water system supplemented its aging wells with contracted deliveries from Hoover's purification plant. When the Mojave campaign collapsed, those dependencies didn't gradually fade, they just stopped. By late December 2281, shortages were visible everywhere. Grocery cooperatives rationed flour and canned vegetables. Construction projects halted for lack of rebar and cement. The Hall of Congress cafeteria served 2 meals a day instead of 3. Citizens who'd grown used to post-war abundance suddenly remembered what scarcity felt like. But the markets were only the surface. The rolling blackouts started January 4, 2282. Hoover Dam had supplied 40% of Shady Sands' electrical grid since 2274, routed through the NCR's Western Transmission Network. When that power stopped flowing, the capital's coal and geothermal plants couldn't cover the gap. Neighborhoods went dark in 4-hour rotations. Factories shut down assembly lines to conserve load. The Republic Metalworks, the largest employer in the industrial zone, cut production to 3 days a week. Water pumps serving the outer districts failed during blackouts, leaving 60,000 residents without running water for hours at a time. The emergency diesel generators the government deployed ran through their fuel reserves in 11 days. What Congress had debated as a question of military strategy revealed itself as infrastructure collapse. Shady Sands hadn't just invested in the Mojave, it had built itself on Mojave resources, Mojave energy, Mojave supply chains. Kimball's expansion had turned the capital into a city that couldn't function without the territory it had just lost, and the emergency session that followed would be President Kimball's last. The no-confidence motion passed the Senate 31-18 on January 19, 2282. The coalition against Kimball cut across party lines. Senators from the Boneyard and Dayglow who'd opposed the Mojave campaign from the start, moderates who'd supported expansion but couldn't defend the outcome, even 3 hawks who saw the infrastructure crisis as proof of failed leadership. The vote wasn't even close. Kimball didn't contest it. He attended the final session, heard the charges read: military overreach, fiscal negligence, failure to secure critical infrastructure, and walked out of the chamber without a statement. 2 days later, he vacated the presidential residence in Shady Sands and returned to his family ranch outside Redding. No trial, no public defense, just a quiet exit from the capital he'd tried to make the center of an empire. He'd live another 14 years, dying of pneumonia in 2296 at age 71, never holding public office again. Some historians would remember him as the president who overreached, others as the one who dared to push the NCR beyond its borders and paid the price when fortune turned. Either way, his fall marked the end of the Republic's expansionist era. The seat didn't stay empty long. The emergency election of 2282 happened fast. Regional governors, desperate to project stability, pushed through a compressed primary that left only 3 candidates standing. Cassandra Moore, the Mojave campaign's ranking general after Oliver's recall, won 64% of the vote on a platform that promised exactly one thing: bring the Republic back inside its borders. She'd been Oliver's second throughout the campaign, but where he'd seen the dam as a springboard to Arizona, she'd watched supply lines stretch and soldiers die for territory the NCR couldn't hold. Her inaugural address lasted 9 minutes. She ordered the immediate closure of 11 forward operating bases, the consolidation of 4 eastern trade routes, and the reallocation of $43 million villiers in military spending to agricultural infrastructure in the core territories. Shady Sands would be self-sufficient again, she promised. The capital would no longer depend on boneyard grain or Vault City water. The homesteaders who'd built the Republic from Vault 15's ashes deserved better than to watch their city hollow out while the army chased ghosts in the Mojave. It was a popular message. The Senate confirmed her cabinet appointments in 72 hours. But her first briefing revealed a problem that couldn't be solved with policy. The documents arrived 6 days into her term. Shipped under armed escort from a Vault-Tec administrative facility, the Rangers had uncovered outside Searchlight. 14 boxes of pre-war files, mostly urban planning schematics and experimental protocols for the Southwestern Vault network. Standard salvage, the kind of thing that usually went straight to the OSI archives at the Boneyard. Except one of Moore's aides, a former follower with a degree in pre-war history, noticed something odd in the filing codes. Cross-references to Vault 15 that didn't match any experiment the NCR had on record. Site surveys for Shady Sands, dated 2077, 6 months before the bombs fell. Infrastructure plans that assumed post-war settlement patterns the designers couldn't have predicted. Moore ordered a full review. What the archivists found over the next 3 weeks didn't add up. Vault-Tec had surveyed the site where Shady Sands now stood, marked it on internal maps as a high-priority observation zone, and built monitoring stations within a 15-mile radius, not for Vault 15 itself, which sat 40 miles north, for the area where Aradesh's people would later build their village. And the more the archivists dug, the stranger Vault 15's story became. The official history said Vault 15's experiment was simple: seal people with radically different ideologies together, wait for conflict, study the results. When the vault opened in 2097, 4 factions split off. One of them, led by Aradesh, founded Shady Sands. Clean narrative, verified by the Vault's own records, except the Searchlight files described a second phase. Vault-Tec's internal memos referenced post-opening triggers, environmental variables that would activate after the Vault dwellers reached the surface, specific geographic coordinates where settlements were expected to form, psychological profiles suggesting certain leaders, Aradesh among them, had been selected not for ideological diversity, but for traits Vault-Tec called civic plasticity, the ability to build functional governance from nothing. The timeline didn't work either. Aradesh's own journals, stored in Shady Sands Historical Museum, described finding the village site by accident after 3 weeks of wandering. But the Vault-Tec surveys marked that exact location 19 years earlier, with soil samples, water table analysis, and a note that read, "Optimal for Phase 2 agriculture and rapid population density." They'd known where the Vault dwellers would go before the Vault dwellers did. And then they found the beacon. The signal was coming from 47 meters below Foundation Square, the oldest district in Shady Sands, a repeating pulse on a pre-war frequency band that nothing built after 2077 was designed to listen for. The Republic's own radio infrastructure had been broadcasting right over it for 80 years, but the Vault-Tec equipment the analysts found in the archives could still hear it, and when they powered up a receiver pulled from storage, the transmission locked in clean and steady. It was encrypted with a rotating cipher keyed to the date, updating every 24 hours since October 23, 2077. The mathematicians said the algorithm was elegant, corporate, and completely paranoid. The decryption took 3 days. The message header read, Experiment 17, Post-Vault Settlement Viability. Shady Sands wasn't an accident. The village, the farms, the water source 2 kilometers west, the caravan routes that formed in the 2160s, all of it had been mapped out in advance. Vault 15's social experiment, the one everyone knew about, that was Phase 1. Phase 2 was watching what happened when you opened the door and let the vault dwellers try to build something without Vault-Tec telling them how. The transmission logs showed status updates filed every 30 days. Population growth, agricultural output, conflict resolution methods, governmental structure formation. Every city council meeting, every harvest, every border dispute with the raiders. All of it reduced to data points in a report no human being had read in a century. But the message didn't end there. The engineers started finding the hardware in June 2282. Sensor packages embedded in the foundations of buildings that dated back to 2141. Radiation counters inside the original water purification tanks. Atmospheric samplers hidden in what everyone thought were just old utility boxes. The equipment was still operational. Battery systems that should have died in 2080 were running on trickle charge from geothermal cells buried 90 meters down. Every sensor was networked, feeding data to a collection node beneath the Senate building. The logs showed transmissions sent to 6 different Vault-Tec regional monitoring stations, all of them destroyed in the war or abandoned decades ago. The last confirmed receipt was March 11, 2078, 4 months after the bombs fell. After that, the sensors just kept recording, kept transmitting to facilities that were either rubble or silent. And then the engineers found the other installation. The installation sat 47 meters beneath the new Senate building. In a reinforced chamber, the original Vault 15 settlers had unknowingly built right on top of. An automated weapons platform, military grade, with enough ordnance to level 6 city blocks. The access codes were pre-war. The activation parameters were written in Vault-Tec's own secure protocol. It was designed to monitor biometric data, population density, governance patterns. If the experiment deviated beyond acceptable thresholds, if the control group showed signs of what Vault-Tec called catastrophic social regression, the platform would activate, sterilize the site, protect the integrity of the data. The engineers found the maintenance logs intact. Last diagnostic check, October 22, 2077, the day before the bombs dropped. Status: armed and operational, and buried in 83 lines of status code, a single entry that made Major Hayes stop breathing. The timer was still running. Operation Black File went active at 0400 hours on June 3, 2282. 19 teams, each one accompanied by a member of the original engineering crew, each one sworn to secrecy under threat of treason charges. They had 3 weeks to locate and disable every fail-safe system Vault-Tec had embedded in Shady Sands' infrastructure before the Senate reconvened. They found 14 installations, gas dispensers in the old water treatment plant, radiation emitters in 3 residential blocks, a biological agent reservoir beneath the hospital that had been leaking trace amounts into the groundwater for 6 years. The disarmament protocols were Byzantine, each system protected by pre-war security AI that had to be negotiated with, bypassed, or in 2 cases, physically destroyed before it could activate. The weapons platform took 11 days. They had to cut through 4 meters of reinforced concrete without triggering vibration sensors, then convince a computer that hadn't updated its threat assessment since 2077 that the war was over. On June 19th, at 2:37 a.m., the final system went dark. But the secret couldn't stay buried. The leak came from a junior engineer who told his brother, who told a reporter at the Shady Sands Tribune. By June 24th, the full story was on every radio station from the Boneyard to the Hub. The capital had been one malfunction away from annihilation for 204 years. Every school, every home, every Senate session had happened on top of a Vault-Tec kill switch. The protests started that night. 40,000 people in Republic Square, demanding answers, demanding resignations, demanding to know who knew and when. The conspiracy theories spread faster than the NCR Rangers could track them. Some said Aradesh knew from the beginning. Some said Tandy had covered it up. Some said President Moore had triggered the disarmament herself to manufacture a crisis. By July, the calls to relocate the capital had support in 7 regional legislatures. The followers of the apocalypse published a 94-page report on the psychological damage of living in a city built on a lie. Vault City sent a delegation offering to host the government in exile. Moore gave 3 addresses trying to calm the situation. None of them worked. And while the capital burned, the frontier territories started talking about independence. The Baja Territorial Councils met in emergency session on March 19, 2282. By March 21st, 3 of them had drafted formal resolutions questioning Shady Sands' authority. The hub's commercial guild sent a letter that was blunter. Why should free settlements answer to a capital literally built on Vault-Tec's experiment? Moore dispatched diplomatic teams within 48 hours. She offered regional autonomy packages, tax concessions, guaranteed Senate representation for every territory that signed a loyalty compact. The Mojave got veto power over military deployments through their land. Baja got trade tariff exemptions for 10 years. It bought time. The hub signed. Baja's northern councils signed. But the southernmost settlements refused, and 2 mining towns in Nevada declared themselves neutral, pending a constitutional convention. The NCR held together, barely, with duct tape and promises Moore knew she might not be able to keep. But the real fracture was forming inside Shady Sands itself. The movement called itself Citizens for a Pure Republic. It started with 200 people in a town hall on April 3, 2282, demanding the capital be relocated to a settlement not built on pre-war manipulation. Within 2 weeks, they had 4,000 members and a slate of Senate candidates. Their argument was simple. Every brick in Shady Sands, every water pipe, every power conduit traced back to Vault 15's social experiment. The city wasn't a triumph of human resilience. It was Vault-Tec's lab rat that survived. Building a democracy on top of that foundation poisoned everything the NCR claimed to stand for. The pragmatists called them insane. Senator Shue pointed out that 94,000 people lived in Shady Sands, that the industrial base, the farmland, the infrastructure couldn't be replicated in a generation. Moving the capital would cripple the republic during a war. The purists didn't care. They argued survival without principle was just slow death. And then someone bombed the Senate building. The explosion tore through the West Wing at 9:47 a.m. on April 29, 2282, during a Budget Committee session. 7 senators died instantly. 12 more were pulled from the rubble with burns and shrapnel wounds. The bomb had been planted in a maintenance crawl space 18 hours earlier. Timer detonated, packed with pre-war plastic explosive and nails. Moore locked down the city. NCR military police arrested 43 people in the first 72 hours. Most of them purist organizers. 6 of them with demolitions training from their ranger days. The evidence was circumstantial, but mounting. Purchase records for timing components, a safe house with blast residue, a manifesto draft calling for cleansing fire to purge the contaminated heart. But the investigators also found shell casings at the safe house that matched enclave remnant stockpiles, a radio frequency scanner tuned to NCR military bands, and $15,000 in pre-war gold certificates no purist cell could have afforded. On May 8th, Ranger Forensics arrested Marcus Webb, a purist youth organizer. He confessed within 6 hours, on tape, to building and planting the device. But the confession tape revealed something stranger than terrorism. Webb hadn't been working alone. The interrogation logs show he mentioned a contact, someone who'd given him the schematics, the materials, and a very specific set of instructions. Rangers traced the drop points back through 3 safe houses to a bunker 87 miles northeast of the boneyard. Inside, They found 14 people, military-grade equipment, and 9 intact Vault-Tec experimental protocol files. Files that had been stolen from a Poseidon Energy server farm in 2247. The group called themselves Continuity Cell Sigma. We know them as Enclave Remnants. Their working theory, documented across 400 pages of internal memos, was that Vault 15's GECK success proved Vault dwellers carried superior genetics. They believed Shady Sands wasn't just a city, it was a breeding population they could control. The bombing wasn't meant to destroy the Senate. It was meant to collapse the government, so Sigma could step in as saviors, as the rightful heirs to pre-war order. President Moore received the full intelligence brief on May 11, 2274, and Moore's response would define her presidency. Martial law went into effect at 06 on May 12. NCR military police checkpoints appeared on every major road into Shady Sands. Citizens needed written authorization to move between districts. The curfew ran from 20 o'clock to 06, enforced with detainment, not warnings. Moore invoked Emergency Executive Order 31, a pre-war statute that let the president suspend habeas corpus during existential threats. Over the next 43 days, Rangers and MPs arrested 1,847 individuals on suspicion of enclave collaboration or purist sympathies. 6 senators called it a necessary purge. 9 called it a coup in slow motion. The trials ran in military tribunal format, closed to the press. 211 defendants were convicted. 14 were executed by firing squad at Camp McCarran. Webb himself was sentenced to life at the Mojave Maximum Security Facility. The Enclave cell members, all 14, received death sentences carried out within 72 hours of verdict. By late June, the lockdown eased, but the laws didn't roll back. Moore retained expanded surveillance powers, indefinite detention authority, and the right to classify any investigation as a state secret. Senator Thorne from the Hub called it the end of the old republic. But while the capital locked down, the frontier was burning. Vault 3 had been quiet for years, a sealed tomb in the northwest Mojave. Then in early 2274, a band of chem traders cracked it open, looking for pre-war medical supplies. What they found was a functional vault and 6 tons of stockpiled chems. What found them was a man named Motor Runner. By April, the fiends controlled a 40-mile radius around Vault 3. Psycho, Jet, and Med-X flowed like water. NCR supply convoys coming east from the 15 started disappearing. On May 19th, while Shady Sands was still under martial law, a fiend war party hit the Aerotech refugee camp. 64 civilians died. 130 fled south toward the NCR border. Camp McCarran went to high alert, but most of the garrison had been pulled back to Shady Sands for security duty during the purge. Colonel Shue requested immediate reinforcements. Moore's office, overwhelmed by the internal crisis, sent 40 Rangers and told him to hold the line. Shue dispatched Ranger Company Echo on June 2nd to sweep Vault 3 and establish a perimeter. The convoy reached the vault's outer marker at 1430. Radio contact confirmed arrival. At 16, McCarran tried to check in for the evening sit-rep. No response. They tried again at 18, at 20, at midnight, and the Rangers who rode out never sent back a single report. By the time the search parties found them, 3 weeks had passed. 14 Rangers, scattered across a 6-mile radius south of Vault 3, shot from behind, most of them execution style. Every helmet was gone, every rifle, every sidearm, every piece of combat armor stripped clean. The NCR forensics team cataloged 127 missing items, including 2 brush guns and a riot shotgun that had been checked out of the Camp McCarran armory under Ranger Morales' signature. Moore put a 10,000 cap bounty on information. Nothing. The Mojave outpost reported no large weapons shipments moving through their checkpoint. The first recon sharpshooters who'd been watching the Fiend camps saw no deliveries, no caravans, no dead drops. And yet, within 2 months, Fiends operating near Camp Golf were carrying NCR-issue service rifles. 3 separate patrols reported being fired on with what sounded like Ranger Sequoias, because the Fiends had found a new supplier. The gunrunners had been the NCR's primary weapons contractors since 2241. 45 years of service rifles, ammunition, spare parts. A relationship so trusted that their Vendortron units operated inside NCR military bases with almost no oversight. The audit Moore ordered in March 2281 found discrepancies going back 4 years. 800 rifles logged as destroyed, scrap metal receipts signed by officials who didn't exist, a procurement officer in Shady Sands who'd approved 17 emergency requisitions for a forward operating base that had been decommissioned in 2278. The gunrunner's New Vegas factory manager, a man named Isaac, kept 2 sets of books. The official ledger matched NCR records perfectly. The second ledger, hidden in a safe behind a false wall, listed 63 transactions with a buyer identified only as Red Rock. Payment in pre-war military electronics, sensor modules, anything with intact circuitry. Isaac's personal terminal had been wiped 4 hours before the Rangers arrived to arrest him. Wiped with NCR military-grade data destruction software that required authorization codes from the Shady Sands Intelligence Bureau. And when Moore ordered the arrests, half the suspects were already gone. They called it the Railroad because that's what the forged travel papers said. Employees of the New Reno Railroad Company, a freight operation that hadn't existed since 2077. 11 officials, 4 procurement clerks, 2 Intelligence Bureau analysts, all gone within 72 hours of Moore's audit order. The safe house in Freeside had been abandoned in a hurry. Half-eaten meals on the table, NCR uniforms in the trash, a map with routes marked east toward Bitter Springs and then beyond, into territory the Republic had mapped but never secured. The manager of the Atomic Wrangler said a man matching one description had paid for a caravan escort to Novak, cash only, no questions. Novak's records showed the caravan arriving, staying one night, then heading southeast toward Cottonwood Cove, not north toward McCarran, not west back to Shady Sands, southeast toward the river, toward the area where NCR patrols had standing orders not to engage. The ranger sent to investigate never made it past Ranger Station Charlie. Her last transmission reported movement on the far side of the Colorado. Multiple contacts, professional discipline. She requested immediate backup at 1422 on April 3, 2281, because the Legion had been watching the whole time. The diplomatic pouch arrived in Shady Sands 6 days later, sealed with Caesar's personal mark. Inside was a proposal that would have been unthinkable 3 years earlier. A formal border agreement along the Colorado River, a non-aggression pact between 2 sovereign powers, and the immediate return of 147 NCR prisoners of war. Caesar's letter argued that 2 empires could coexist if both respected the other's sphere. That endless conflict served neither civilization. The language was formal, almost respectful. It acknowledged NCR losses, recognized the Republic's legitimacy, even praised its agricultural achievements. President Kimball read it twice, then passed it to General Moore without comment. The Senate received copies the next morning. 3 senators called for immediate acceptance. 7 demanded the Legion's unconditional surrender. 12 wanted to hear the full terms before deciding anything. But the price was 1 city. Caesar's condition was buried in paragraph 11 of the proposal. The NCR would relocate its capital from Shady Sands to any other settlement within its territory. He argued that Shady Sands carried too much symbolic weight, that its status as the birthplace of the Republic made true peace impossible. As long as the NCR governed from the city where it was born, he wrote, it would always see itself as destined to rule the wasteland. A republic, he suggested, could govern from anywhere. Rome had moved its capital multiple times. The location mattered less than the institutions. General Moore's response was 4 words, all of them unprintable. But Senator Holbrook from the Hub asked the question nobody wanted to hear. What if he's right? Not about destiny or symbolism, but about the practical reality that Shady Sands was bleeding the Republic dry just to keep standing. And the vote was closer than anyone expected. The Senate debated for 31 days. Historians cited the founding, the original settlement, the symbolic importance of governing from the Republic's birthplace. Economists presented spreadsheets showing that relocating government functions to the Hub or New Reno would save 400,000 caps annually in infrastructure maintenance alone. Military strategists argued that Shady Sands' position left it vulnerable, that a capital should be defensible. Senator Tandy Moore reminded the chamber that her grandmother had founded the Republic in Shady Sands, that abandoning the city meant abandoning everything the NCR stood for. Senator Holbrook countered that the Republic was its people and laws, not a specific plot of crumbling concrete. He pointed to the subsidence reports, the water crisis, the fact that half the Senate was already suggesting relocation for purely practical reasons. By April 17th, the vote count was 16-15 in favor of accepting Caesar's terms. 7 senators remained undecided. President Kimball scheduled the final vote for April 19th at 10 o'clock, and then the earthquake hit. It came at 10:14 in the morning, 14 minutes after the vote was meant to begin. The floor of the Senate hall lifted, dropped, and the ceiling tiles rained down on senators who'd argued for an hour about whether the city was even worth saving. Outside, the old brick facades along the main avenue folded inward, and 3 of the oldest buildings, the ones dating back to Tandy's council, came down in under a minute. The water mains ruptured beneath the market district, and streets that had been dry that morning turned to mud by noon. Rescue crews pulled people from the rubble for 2 days straight. When the count was finished, 214 people were dead, hundreds more injured, and a third of the old town center was rubble. The strange thing wasn't the damage. Shady Sands sat far from any known fault, and the pre-war surveys had marked the ground as stable. But the engineers who surveyed the damage found something impossible. The cracks weren't radiating outward from a single point the way earthquake fractures do. They ran in long parallel lines, and the ground hadn't shaken so much as dropped. Whole sections of street had sunk 30-40 centimeters overnight, and the pattern followed the exact route of the city's oldest water pipes. When they sent crews down into the maintenance tunnels beneath the district, they found the walls buckling and the floors sloping toward voids that shouldn't have existed. Shady Sands had been pulling water from the aquifer beneath it for over 150 years, since the very first well Tandy's people dug. And the ground that water once held up was collapsing into the empty space left behind. This wasn't nature. The city had been quietly hollowing out the earth under its own feet for a century and a half. The geologists ran the subsidence rate against the remaining water table, and the projection showed 5 years. The report was classified the day it landed on the council's desk. 5 years until the subsidence reached the residential core. 5 years until the foundations of the Capitol, the hospital, the archives, everything sat over ground too weak to hold them, and no amount of engineering could stop it, because the thing giving way wasn't a building, it was the planet underneath. They'd run the numbers on capping the wells, on trucking water in, on grouting the tunnels solid. Every option came back the same. The water table was drained past recovery, and the collapse would only speed up as the remaining pockets gave out. Shady Sands, the oldest city the NCR had, the place where the whole nation started, would be uninhabitable within 5 years, no matter what anyone did. It read like a death sentence, because that's what it was. But Moore refused to accept it. Moore called it Project Renewal. The plan was simple in concept, impossible in execution. Drive foundation pilings 200 meters down through fractured bedrock, pump specialized concrete into every cavity the seismic surveys could map, and reroute what was left of the aquifer through a network of reinforced channels that would take 8 years to complete. She put out a call for every civil engineer, geologist, and structural specialist in NCR territory. Within 3 months, 847 professionals had reported to Shady Sands. The Republic's entire construction budget was redirected. Every steel mill from the hub to Dayglow started running triple shifts. The initial timeline projected 12 years of continuous work, assuming no major collapses during reinforcement. The Senate Engineering Committee reviewed the proposal for 6 weeks. Their report used the word unprecedented 34 times. Chief Engineer Castellan called it the most ambitious infrastructure project since Hoover Dam. Nobody said it was impossible. Nobody said it would definitely work, either. Moore ordered the first pilings driven on August 3, 2279. For 14 months, the drills ran day and night. The sound echoed through every district. Citizens learned to sleep through vibrations that rattled windows and cracked plaster. Progress reports came weekly, each one showing foundation zones stabilized, aquifer breaches sealed, structural loads redistributed. The Senate started drafting long-term budgets that assumed the city would still exist in 2290, and then the money ran out. The Treasury Secretary's report landed on Moore's desk October 11, 2280. 63 pages of numbers that all said the same thing. Decades of expansion into Nevada, Arizona, and Baja had drained NCR reserves faster than tax revenue could rebuild them. The Mojave campaign alone was costing 850,000 caps per month, and that was before the Brotherhood War. Project Renewal's revised budget came to 47 million caps over 10 years. The Republic had 11 million in accessible reserves. Borrowing from hub financial houses would require collateral the NCR didn't have. Raising taxes would trigger riots in territories already stretched thin by conscription and resource quotas. The math was brutal, and it didn't change no matter how many times the economists ran it. Moore had 2 choices: abandon Project Renewal, let Shady Sands collapse, and relocate the capital with the treasury intact. Or drain every cap the Republic had, pull back from every frontier territory, and bet everything on saving the city. The withdrawal would mean leaving 140,000 NCR citizens in settlements from Searchlight to Bullhead without military protection or administrative support. The Senate argued for 9 days straight. Colonel Shue submitted a tactical analysis showing that abandoning the Mojave would hand Caesar a clear path to the Colorado. Senator Morales countered that bankrupting the Republic to save one city would destroy the nation faster than any Legion advance. Moore listened to all of it. Read every projection, every casualty estimate, every economic model, and she chose the city. Executive Order 187 went out November 1, 2280. Every NCR garrison east of Barstow and north of Dayglow received the same directive. Cease all operations, secure your equipment, and return to core territories within 90 days. Camp McCarran, the Mojave Outpost, Fort Aradesh, and 23 smaller installations were to be evacuated completely. No exceptions, no delays. The refugees started moving within a week. Farmers who'd worked NCR-protected land for a decade, traders who'd operated under Republic contracts, settlers who'd believed the flag meant something permanent. They packed what they could carry and joined the columns heading west. The roads to Shady Sands filled with 40,000 people who had nowhere else to go. Legion scouts watched from the hills and didn't even bother attacking. They just waited. By January 2281, the frontier councils were declaring independence. New Reno's crime families carved up the city into territories. Hopeville's merchants established their own trade confederation. Searchlight's mayor announced they'd negotiate directly with Vegas. The Republic's borders contracted to a 200-mile radius around the hub. Everything the NCR had spent 80 years building east of the Mojave was gone in 4 months. Moore watched it happen from Shady Sands, while the foundation pilings went deeper. She signed supply requisitions with one hand and withdrawal orders with the other. The Senate stopped meeting because half its members represented territories that no longer existed, and the convoys heading home were attacked by their own people. The attacks weren't from raiders or Legion deserters. They were from NCR citizens, farmers who'd been promised protection when they moved north 20 years ago, town councils who'd voted to join the Republic and watched their neighbors die in NCR uniforms. They saw the withdrawal as betrayal, and they weren't wrong. Convoy escorts reported gunfire from settlements they'd defended the year before. Supply depots were sabotaged by the same people who'd built them. In Reading, a group of veterans barricaded the NCR administrative building and refused to leave until President Kimball personally told them why their service didn't matter anymore. The military had orders not to return fire against civilians. That lasted 3 weeks. After a convoy lost 14 soldiers to an IED outside New Reno, the rules changed. The Republic that had promised to bring civilization to the wasteland was now shooting people who wanted to stay part of it. Over 400 people died in what the records carefully call withdrawal security incidents. The NCR lost more citizens to itself during the retreat than it had lost to Caesar in the previous year. But Shady Sands needed every resource for what came next. Project Renewal was the largest construction effort in NCR history. Engineers drove 200 steel pilings 40 meters down to bedrock under the government quarter. They replaced every water main with seismically flexible pipe and built 3 new recycling plants that could operate independently if the main grid failed. Brahman caravans brought 8,000 tons of concrete from hub quarries. Steel came from Maxon, traded at prices that made the Senate furious, but the timeline possible. The work ran 24 hours a day for 26 months. You could hear the pile drivers from anywhere in the city, a constant hammering that some people said sounded like a heartbeat. By 2279, the visible results were undeniable. The Hall of Congress stopped cracking. Water pressure stabilized across the eastern districts. The chief engineer gave a presentation to the Senate showing stress measurements that had improved by 60%. President Kimball stood in front of the newly reinforced plaza and told reporters that Shady Sands would stand for another century. The monitoring instruments were checked every week. The data was reviewed by 3 independent teams. Every report said the same thing. The subsidence had slowed by half. What none of them said out loud, what the graphs showed if you looked at the trend line instead of the month-to-month numbers, was simpler, because the ground was still sinking. The crack appeared in the Senate chamber on March 4, 2281. Not in the old sections they'd been watching, in the new foundation. It ran diagonally across the floor, half a centimeter wide, and by the time engineers arrived an hour later, it had grown to 2 centimeters. By evening, they'd evacuated the entire government district. The pilings hadn't failed. The bedrock they were anchored to had. The weight of the reinforced buildings was compressing the substrate faster than the original structures had. Project Renewal had created localized pressure points that accelerated exactly what it was designed to prevent. One engineer's report put it simply: we made it worse. Over the next 6 weeks, the Hall of Congress developed a 15-degree tilt. The western wall of the Supreme Tribunal building separated from its foundation. Residential blocks that had been stable for decades suddenly required evacuation. The seismic sensors that had shown improvement now registered constant microshifts, the geological equivalent of a structure tearing itself apart in slow motion. President Kimball ordered a full structural assessment. The chief engineer delivered it in person, in a meeting with no recording and only 5 people present. The summary that leaked to the press 3 days later contained one number and one conclusion. The reinforcements had bought time, not salvation, and this time, the estimate was 2 years. The emergency session convened at 6 a.m. on March 14, 2278. Moore stood at the podium for 4 minutes without speaking, the chamber silent except for the hum of failing ventilation systems. When she finally began, she used the word evacuation 11 times in her opening statement. She never once used the word temporary. The proposal was simple on paper: relocate the seat of government to a stable city before the next collapse made the decision for them. Transfer critical archives, ministries, and personnel over 18 months. Establish Shady Sands as a protected historical site once the population had been safely resettled. The vote to begin planning passed 47-3. Then came the question no one wanted to answer. The hub had infrastructure and water. Arroyo had symbolic weight as the birthplace of the tribal alliance. Dayglow offered coastal access and pre-war industrial capacity. Vault City had technology the Republic had never stopped coveting. Each delegate saw a different future, and each future required a different capital. But the delegates couldn't agree on where. The debate lasted 19 days. Moore let it run, knowing that every delegate needed to believe their city had been fairly considered. The final vote came down to logistics over sentiment. The hub had functioning rail connections to 7 major settlements, existing government buildings large enough to house the displaced ministries, and a water supply that wasn't killing its own citizens. The tally was 34-16. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the chamber. The NCR had been born from a compact between Shady Sands, the hub, and 3 smaller settlements in 2189. Now, 89 years later, the Republic was returning to one of its founding cities because the jewel of the wasteland could no longer support human life. History bending back on itself, the way it always did out here. The transition plan called for the first ministries to relocate by January 2079, with full transfer completed by mid-2280. Moore would remain as acting president through the move, coordinating from Shady Sands until the new Congress convened at the hub. It was the logical arrangement, the stable choice, and Moore announced she wouldn't be making the journey. The resignation came 3 days after the vote, not a resignation from office, technically. A resignation from survival. Moore told the Senate she would oversee the evacuation from Shady Sands, that her place was with the city until the last transport left, that someone had to stay, and it was going to be her. She'd spent 40 years in Shady Sands. She wasn't interested in learning to sleep anywhere else. The speech lasted 11 minutes. She laid out the evacuation priorities, the timelines for each district, the criteria for determining who left first. Families with children, then the elderly, then essential personnel as their services could be transferred. She would coordinate housing placement in the hub, track every citizen through the relocation process, and ensure no one was left behind because they couldn't afford transport. It was the kind of promise politicians made when they knew they wouldn't have to keep it. Except Moore had never broken her word in 4 decades of public service, and everyone in that chamber knew she wasn't starting now. The applause, when it came, sounded like a funeral, and the evacuation took longer than anyone planned. The official timeline called for 18 months. It took 27. Every week brought new reasons to delay. Families who needed one more harvest. Businesses that couldn't liquidate fast enough. Infrastructure too valuable to abandon without proper salvage. The Treasury sent crews to strip copper wiring and steel reinforcement from condemned buildings. The trains ran on reduced schedules, then weekends only, then not at all. By August 2280, the population had dropped from 94,000 to 11,000. Most were salvage contractors working under hazard pay, stripping what the Republic could sell. The residential quarters stood empty, windows dark, streets silent, except for the groan of settling foundations. Census records show 1,847 residents who simply refused the relocation orders, families who'd lived in Shady Sands for 3 or 4 generations and saw no future anywhere else. The final government convoy left on November 12, 2280. Moore wasn't on it. She'd moved into a small apartment in the administrative district 6 weeks earlier, the same building where Aradesh had kept his first office in 2189. Her staff begged. The Senate sent formal requests. She answered every letter the same way. When the last citizen leaves, I'll leave. Seismic sensors recorded increasing subsidence through December and January. The Republic evacuated the remaining salvage teams on February 3, 2281. Moore stayed, and when the subsidence finally accelerated, she was still there. The ground opened at 4:17 a.m. on February 18, 2281. Seismographs at the hub, 140 miles west, recorded a magnitude 6.2 event lasting 43 seconds. The entire government district, 22 blocks, dropped 60 feet into the destabilized cavern system below. Reinforced concrete that had survived 200 years of wasteland weather shattered like pottery. Observers in the outer districts reported a sound like continuous thunder, a dust cloud that rose 800 feet and turned the sunrise red. When it cleared, the Senate building, the Supreme Court, the Central Archives, everything east of Founding Square had vanished into a crater half a mile wide. Rescue teams found the administrative block's foundation sheared clean, the building itself gone. Moore's body was never recovered. The Senate voted her a state funeral anyway, an empty casket carried through the streets of the hub while 200,000 people lined the route in silence. She was 71. The republic she'd led for 11 years had lost its capital, its archives, and 40% of its accessible gold reserves in a single morning. Official death toll, 127. Mostly holdout families living in condemned buildings near the collapse zone. Unofficial estimates ran higher, but the city didn't die with her. The outer districts, built on stable bedrock 2 miles from the old vault entrance, survived intact. Within 3 months, people started coming back. Not the government officials or the merchant families who'd relocated to the hub, but scavengers, traders, families with nowhere else to go. They moved into the abandoned residential blocks, cleared rubble from the streets, reopened the western marketplace. By 2282, roughly 3,000 people were living in what locals started calling the Shady Remnant. No central authority, no tax collectors, just communities of holdouts and newcomers carving out a life in the ruins. The crater became a salvage site, crews lowering themselves on ropes to pull pre-war steel and electronics from the wreckage. Dangerous work, 19 documented deaths in the first year alone. The NCR Rangers maintained a small outpost on the western edge, partly to monitor the site, partly because some things in the deep ruins were better left undisturbed. Patrols reported strange lights in the crater at night, sounds that didn't match any known creature. The official line was seismic aftershocks and disturbed wildlife. The rangers who walked those routes told different stories off the record. Trade caravans started routing through again by 2283, using the intact western roads. The remnant became a waypoint, then a market, then something close to a functioning town. No mayor, no council, just people who'd chosen to stay or had nowhere else to be. And the Republic's new government issued a strange decree. Shady Sands was designated Memorial Territory 1 in 2287. No settlement, no mining, no large-scale salvage within the original city limits. The Hub Senate sent patrols to enforce it, rotating rangers who kept squatters out and scavengers to the outer ruins. The official line was preservation, a monument to the Republic's birthplace, a symbol of what they'd lost and what they'd carry forward, clean enough for the public record. But the patrols weren't guarding rubble. They were stationed at 3 specific points: the old vault entrance, the reactor crater, and the communications hub the OSI had quietly rebuilt in 2282. The Rangers rotated every 6 weeks, and their orders were classified above Senate clearance. Because the Vault-Tec beacon was still transmitting, the OSI pulled the files in 2285, buried in Vault 15's secondary servers under 14 layers of encryption. The beacon wasn't a distress call, it was a network ping, part of a continental grid Vault-Tec had embedded in 52 facilities before the bombs fell. Experimental sites checking in with each other, sleeper installations waiting for activation codes. A grand design where every vault was a data point, every experiment a variable in something larger. Shady Sands had been Node 15 in a system that was supposed to coordinate the rebuilding of civilization under corporate control. The beacon had pulsed every 6 hours for 211 years. Most of the grid was silent, vaults collapsed or their systems long dead. But 7 signals were still active across the western states, and the OSI had confirmed at least 3 were coming from sites no one had ever mapped. And somewhere in the Mojave, something answered back. Shady Sands was an accident that became inevitable. A vault meant to fail. A town that survived anyway. A republic built on the wreckage of an experiment its founders never understood. For 164 years, it stood as proof that people could take the wasteland's cruelty and build something better. The NCR governs from the hub now, 850 miles south, where the Senate chambers overlook trade routes instead of empty desert. The debate over abandoning Shady Sands still fractures sessions. Some call it pragmatism. Others call it surrender. But the Republic endures. 340,000 citizens under 5 allied states, still expanding, still arguing over what it means to be civilized in a world that tried very hard to end civilization. What Shady Sands proved was simpler than any vault experiment. You can hand people a script and they'll tear it up. You can design failure and they'll build a nation. The city's greatest achievement wasn't lasting. It was showing that vault dwellers could create something that outlasted Vault-Tec's plans. The Master's invasion, the Enclave's return, and every other nightmare the wasteland threw at them. The ruins still stand, the beacon still transmits, and whatever Vault-Tec built into the bedrock of the NCR, the Republic will have to deal with it on their own terms. As of 2288, the story of Shady Sands is over, but the story of what it became is still being written.